The year is 1987, and you're sitting in an Australian living room, the kind with floral couches and wood panel walls, when the television flickers on. A new sitcom fills the screen, bright laugh tracks wrapping around the safe little world of Hey Dad. At the center of it all is Robert Hughes, a smiling father figure who seems to embody suburban comfort. He's the kind of man who cracks a corny joke, shrugs his shoulders, and makes families feel like everything in the world is tidy and secure. For years, millions welcomed him into their homes, never suspecting that behind those easy lines and cozy scenes, shadows were gathering. What viewers couldn't see was the uneasy silence of young cast members and the hidden fears that would only surface decades later, when the laughter was gone and only memories remained. Welcome back to 102 Hours, where you and I sink into the kind of stories that slip past the edges of comfort and linger in the quiet. You're here because you want the truth, even when it unsettles you, even when it feels heavy in the chest. So let's breathe in slowly together. Tonight, we peel back the glossy veneer of Australian television in the late 1980s and look at what was concealed behind the bright lights of Hey Dad. If you find yourself drawn into this space, let yourself relax into the cadence. Remember to like, to subscribe if you haven't already, and, because I always love knowing where you cheer listening from, drop your location and your local time down in the comments. It makes this feel less like a broadcast and more like a quiet, global circle. Robert Hughes's ascent to sitcom fame seemed almost inevitable. He had the look of a reliable television dad, sturdy, warm, with just enough bumbling charm to make jokes land even when the writing was thin. Casting directors in the 1980s weren't necessarily searching for nuance. They were looking for someone who fit the part, who audiences could project comfort onto. And Hughes did just that. Hey Dad, produced in Sydney, became one of Australia's most enduring sitcoms, running from 1987 to 1994, outlasting many of its contemporaries and becoming a cultural touchstone for Australian families. It was the kind of program that network executives loved. Inexpensive to produce, easy to market, and wholesome on the surface. But every cultural artifact sits inside a larger moment. And Hey Dad, for all its brightness, was born out of a decade when Australian television was scrambling to keep up with global trends. America had Full House and Growing Pains, sitcoms that painted domestic life as lovable chaos. Australia wanted its own version of that suburban glow. A show where family foibles could be wrapped up in 22 minutes. Hughes became the anchor of that vision. The odd thing, if you look closely, is how quickly audiences accepted the character of Martin Kelly as if he were Hughes himself. It's a phenomenon psychologists sometimes describe as character bleed, when viewers struggle to separate an actor from the role they play, especially if that role is repeated week after week for years. And here lies the first subtle twist in the story. Hughes' image as Australia, as television, Dad created a kind of cultural shield around him, a sense that the man people saw on screen was the man he must be in real life. Investigators still question whether that collective trust delayed accusations from being believed, or at least from being heard. Behind the camera, there were tensions that never made it to the tabloid pages in the 1980s. Cast members, particularly the younger ones, remember moments that felt wrong, though they didn't always have the language at the time to describe them. Sarah Monahan, who played Jenny, was a child actor on the set. In interviews years later, she would recall a growing sense of unease around Hughes. Tiny signals at first, easily ignored, brushed off in the name of professionalism or fear of making trouble. After all, in a tightly run production, child actors are often told to be adaptable, to go along with what adults ask of them. Meanwhile, Hughes himself enjoyed a kind of celebrity immunity. He appeared in magazines, gave cheerful interviews, and attended industry events where he was treated as a beloved fixture of Australian TV. And that's the paradox, isn't it? The more audiences welcomed him into their homes, the more insulated he became from suspicion. In a way, his sitcom success constructed the perfect camouflage. Now, if you tilt your head to the fringe of the story, you notice the way Australia in the late 1980s still clung to a veneer of innocence about its entertainment industry. Hollywood, by contrast, had already seen scandals break around figures whose off-screen lives contradicted their on-screen personas. Australia, smaller in scale and more tightly woven, often believed its celebrities were different, accessible, ordinary, safer. That assumption, in hindsight, feels painfully naive. In those early years, no one in the public could have predicted what would later come crashing down. Parents watched Hey Dad, and some even encouraged their children to audition for parts on the show. It was a mark of prestige, a safe environment, or so it seemed. But the silence of the young, the tension behind closed doors, and the blind trust of audiences all coiled together like a rope that would only unravel much later, strand by strand. And so you find yourself here, peeling away the glossy nostalgia of Australian television, realizing that what once passed for lighthearted entertainment carried within it a darkness that would take decades to emerge. The laughter you hear on those old episodes feels thinner now, doesn't it? Almost ghostly, as if the laugh track itself knew it was covering something that should never have been hidden. You imagine the hum of studio lights, the buzz of microphones being tested, the scent of hairspray lingering in the air. A sitcom set, even in the late 1980s, feels strangely ordinary when the cameras aren't rolling. The walls aren't real brick. The couches are stage props and every laugh you hear is canned. But for a child actor, those spaces become a second home. And it's here, tucked inside the routines of long filming days, that unease first began to take root. Sarah Monahan was just a kid when she stepped into the role of Jenny on Hey Dad. She wore costumes chosen by adults, delivered lines written by adults, and was surrounded daily by a team of people much older than she was. For a while, it seemed fun. Every child actor says that at first. But the truth, which would only tumble out decades later, was that Sarah often felt uncomfortable around Robert Hughes. She wouldn't have used legal language back then. She didn't have those words. But she had instinct. She noticed things that made her skin prickle, the kind of details you carry with you quietly because you're not sure anyone will believe you if you say them out loud. And she wasn't the only one. Other cast members, too, recalled subtle moments that suggested Hughes treated the youngest among them in ways that blurred professional boundaries. Some noticed lingering touches. Others picked up on the way his humor sometimes crossed a line, jokes that didn't feel right, even if everyone else in the studio pretended they hadn't heard. The unsettling part was the silence, the complicity of an industry that prized keeping a show running over investigating unease. That silence wasn't unique to Hey Dad. If you step back into Australian media history, the 1980s and early 1990s were full of protective bubbles around entertainment figures. Management often shrugged off complaints with the excuse that someone was just eccentric or old school. Fringe accounts from stagehands and technicians reveal how they sometimes whispered concerns but rarely escalated them, fearing that speaking up could cost them their jobs. In hindsight, these half-remembered mutterings read like alarm bells that were ignored until they became impossible to dismiss. Sarah Monahan herself would later describe how, as a child, she tried to confide in adults but felt brushed aside. Parents and producers didn't want to believe that the man who played a lovable dad on screen could behave in ways that felt predatory off-screen. It's a classic psychological bind. When someone is framed as trustworthy in public, accusations against them trigger denial more than outrage. Investigators still question whether the industry's reluctance to act sooner made Hughes bolder, allowing him to push limits without fear of consequences. In the wider Australian cultural landscape, television stars carried an unusual weight. There weren't as many channels, not as much global streaming. If you were on a hit show, you weren't just famous. You were a household name. Families structured their weeknights around you. That kind of visibility meant that children who felt uneasy had even less chance of being heard. After all, Who would risk being the one to tarnish a national comfort figure? There's also an odd tidbit worth noting. Some of the "Hey Dad" fan magazines in the early 1990s printed puff pieces about Hughes that now feel chilling. They described him as the ultimate Australian father figure, or the kind of dad every kid wishes they had. Imagine being a young cast member who privately felt unsafe and then seeing that line splashed across a glossy page. It wasn't just Hughes' behavior that trapped them. It was the machinery of public image reinforcing the idea that he was untouchable. Over the years, those memories accumulated. The show ended in 1994, but the unease didn't vanish. Cast members carried it with them into adulthood, tucked away in quiet corners of memory. Some tried to move on, focusing on careers, families, and new identities beyond their sitcom past. Others, though, felt the weight grow heavier, especially as conversations about child safety in the entertainment industry began surfacing globally. The strangest part, perhaps, is how normal everything looked from the outside. When you watch reruns today, the sets look cheerful, the kids smile naturally, and Hughes delivers his lines with smooth timing. But if you tilt the frame just slightly, if you know what survivors have since described, you start to notice the tension in certain moments. The facade cracks, not because the evidence is visible in the episodes, but because you now know what those children were holding inside. For Sarah Monahan, silence eventually became unbearable. In 2010, she went public, speaking to Australian media about what she had endured. It was a shocking revelation, one that broke open a decades-old wall of denial. And yet, what stands out most isn't just the accusations themselves. It is the courage it took to speak after so many years. Because the hardest part of telling the truth, when the world has painted someone as a sitcom dad, is not knowing whether anyone will believe you. That moment of disclosure would ripple far beyond one actress and one man. It would force Australia to reckon with its entertainment history, and it would set in motion the investigation that finally tore down Hughes's carefully built image. But in this section of the story, you're still standing in the uneasy quiet of a sitcom set the air heavy with secrets. The laughter track playing too loudly and the children smiling for the cameras while wishing someone, anyone, would see what was really happening. Picture yourself in an Australian living room in the late 1980s, the carpet shaggy underfoot, the television boxy and humming with static before the channel locks in. On screen, you see Martin Kelly, the bumbling yet lovable dad of Hey Dad, played by Robert Hughes. He's cracking a joke about household chaos, the audience laughter swelling like a tide. For viewers, Hughes became more than an actor. He became the personification of suburban reliability, a father figure who promised safety and familiarity each week. That was his gift, and also his disguise. Hughes cultivated an image that reached beyond the show itself. Magazines described him as approachable, warm, the kind of man who could charm a crowd at a charity event just as easily as he could deliver a punchline on set. At one point, he was even cited as one of Australia's most familiar television faces, a recognition that cemented him in the cultural imagination. To many parents, Hughes wasn't just Martin Kelly, he was the actor they trusted their children to watch and sometimes to work alongside. That overlap between character and actor is one of the quirks of television history. You might recall that American audiences did something similar with actors like Bob Saget in Full House, assuming his wholesome on-screen personality reflected who he was privately. In Australia, Hughes benefited from the same blurred perception. The line between role and reality blurred so much that even whispers of misconduct seemed implausible to fans at the time. Investigators still question whether this mass identification with Australia's dad built a protective wall that delayed justice. From a fringe perspective, you'll find something almost ironic in the set design of Hey Dad itself. The living room backdrop, with its cheery furniture and orderly props, symbolized a tidy, safe world. In hindsight, critics argue that the very set became a metaphor for how audiences were shielded from what they couldn't do out and see. Behind the walls of that fictional home, Secrets remained unseen, just as off-camera tensions never reached the light. As the series grew, so did Hughes's celebrity. He attended award ceremonies, posed for photographs with fans, and was treated with deference in the industry. Producers leaned on his charisma, and network executives saw him as indispensable. In television, ratings are king, and Hughes was the linchpin of one of Australia's most successful sitcoms. Pulling him out or even questioning his behavior would have risked the financial stability of a program that seemed bulletproof. That reluctance to probe too deeply was, in itself, a form of protection. Meanwhile, child actors like Sarah Monahan occupied a delicate space. They were professionals in a technical sense, memorizing lines, hitting marks on stage, but they were also children, vulnerable in ways that adults around them sometimes ignored. The presence of a trusted TV dad figure only heightened that vulnerability. To speak up would have meant challenging not just a man, but an entire cultural myth. Australia in the late 1980s prided itself on producing entertainment that felt distinctly local. Shows like Hey Dad weren't just filler, they were badges of national identity. Proof that Australian TV could stand alongside imports from the United States and Britain. Hughes, by anchoring that success, became more than an actor. He became part of Australia's soft cultural power. His very visibility, however, meant that anyone who doubted him risked being cast as unpatriotic or disruptive to the feel-good narrative. One quirky detail from the period. Some fan clubs created scrapbooks filled with Hughes photographs, calling him TV's Dad of the Year. These amateur compilations, once innocent tokens of admiration, now look almost chilling when viewed in hindsight. They represent not only affection but also the blind trust of audiences who had no reason to question the image projected at them. The contradictions were stark. On one hand, Hughes was a household name, a fixture of nightly laughter. On the other, whispers on set and unease among younger cast members suggested an entirely different reality. But those whispers had nowhere to go. The weight of cultural expectation silenced them, at least for the moment. And so the paradox held. Robert Hughes, as a beloved national figure, his sitcom a symbol of cheerful suburban life, while the darker story stayed hidden behind the bright veneer of stage lights and laugh tracks. It was a performance on two levels, the character that families adored and the private man whose actions would later unravel that illusion completely. You're sitting in 2010, decades after the sitcom lights have dimmed, when the silence finally breaks. Sarah Monahan, once the little girl on Hey Dad, steps forward and tells Australia what she had carried for so long. She describes the unease, the discomfort, the moments on set that no one wanted to see. Her words land like a thunderclap. For years, she had kept the memories folded away, fearing disbelief. Now, her decision to speak pulls back the curtain on Robert Hughes, the man once celebrated as a sitcom father figure. The timing matters. Globally, 2010 was a moment when conversations about child safety in the entertainment industry were beginning to pick up momentum. You think of scandals in other countries, or of testimonies from survivors who finally found strength in numbers. Monahan 89's revelation didn't arrive in isolation. It arrived into a world just starting to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that beloved institutions could harbor hidden abuses. And in Australia, it hit especially hard. Hughes had been woven into the cultural fabric. To hear accusations against him was like being told that your own father had been lying to you all along. Monahan's disclosure wasn't casual. She spoke in interviews, carefully choosing her words, and she braced for backlash. And it came. There were skeptics, people who clung to Hughes's old image, insisting that she must have misunderstood, exaggerated, or even fabricated her story. That skepticism is painful to recall, but it is part of the pattern that survivors face when challenging a powerful narrative. At the same time, her courage emboldened others. Former colleagues began to echo her concerns, and the pattern of silence started to crack. What's striking is how quickly the media pounced on the story. Tabloid covers splashed Hughes' face beside headlines about scandal, while serious outlets tried to piece together what had really happened on the set of Hey Dad. Investigators still question whether the publicity helped or hindered the case. On one hand, the exposure made it impossible to ignore the allegations. On the other, it risked sensationalizing the pain of survivors, turning trauma into fodder for entertainment. And yet, Sarah's voice did something crucial. It shifted the balance of credibility. For years, Hughes had enjoyed the benefit of his sitcom persona. With her public statement, that shield began to erode. In whispered conversations across Australia, people began to ask questions they had never dared to raise before. Was Hey Dad really the wholesome show they remembered? Had they missed the signs? There's an oddly poignant fringe detail here. Some old fan recordings of the sitcom resurfaced online around the same time. Watching them through the lens of Monahan's disclosure, fans said the laughter felt different, almost haunting. What once sounded cheerful now rang hollow, like an echo covering something that should never have been ignored. That shift, how you hear the same sound differently once you know the truth, is one of the strangest tricks of memory. The industry, too, had to reckon with itself. Producers who had worked on the show scrambled to explain what they had seen, or, more often, what they had failed to see. Some claimed ignorance. Others admitted that, in hindsight, there had been warning signs. But none of them had acted in time, and that failure would become a central theme in the unfolding investigation. For Monahan, speaking out meant moving from silence into a spotlight she never wanted. She had already left acting behind, choosing a quieter life. Now, she was thrust into interviews, photo shoots, and the relentless scrutiny of public opinion. It was a risk she took not for fame, but because the weight of secrecy had become unbearable. And so, the story that had simmered quietly for decades finally spilled into the open. A beloved sitcom star stood accused, a culture of silence was called out, and Australia found itself staring into the uncomfortable truth that even the people who seem safest on screen can be hiding the darkest secrets. The breaking of silence wasn't just one person's act of courage. It was the first stone in an avalanche that would bring Hughes to trial and ultimately to justice. Picture the moment when silence turns into investigation. After Sarah Monahan's public disclosures in 2010, Australia, ES police and child protection agencies could no longer ignore what had lingered in whispers for decades. Detectives began reviewing allegations against Robert Hughes, the sitcom star once adored as Australia's dad. For investigators, it was like peeling wallpaper in an old house. Once you tug at one corner, entire strips of hidden damage come loose. The police moved carefully. This wasn't just about one testimony. It was about piecing together a timeline that stretched back to the 1980s. Officers interviewed former cast members, studio workers, and even fans who recalled interactions at public events. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Girls who had been as young as 7 at the time described behavior that had left them shaken, even if they hadn't had the words back then to define it. Each new account lent credibility to the others, building a case that was too structured, too consistent to be dismissed. Mainstream outlets reported on the investigation almost in real time. The Sydney Morning Herald, ABC, and other reputable platforms carried updates as detectives built their case. The public watched closely, torn between disbelief and outrage. After all, Hughes had been a fixture in their homes. How could the dad who cracked jokes about homework and messy kitchens now be the subject of a police file? Investigators still question whether Hughes's celebrity delayed his arrest, or if the careful pace simply reflected the difficulty of proving decades-old crimes. Inside the industry, there was unease. Some former crew members admitted to noticing odd behavior, but said they lacked authority to challenge it. Others flatly denied having seen anything unusual, though their silence now looks more like a shield than ignorance. Fringe stories even circulated about how child actors were told to stay professional if they felt uncomfortable, advice that now reads chillingly inadequate. These little anecdotes, while not central to the legal case, paint a picture of an industry more invested in appearances than in child safety. In 2012, Hughes was formally charged with a series of offenses dating back to the late 1970s and 1980s. The news broke across every major outlet, the headlines sharp and jarring. The sitcom star, once a household name, now facing accusations of sexual assault. Hughes, living in Singapore at the time, denied everything. He portrayed himself as a victim of false memories, of exaggerated claims dredged up by a media machine hungry for scandal. He even returned to Australia to face the charges, walking into courtrooms surrounded by cameras that captured every grimace, every glance downward. For detectives, building a case of this nature was complex. They relied on survivor testimony, corroborated where possible by old production schedules, travel records, and the recollections of adults who had once worked around the set. Some evidence was indirect but powerful. For instance, consistent accounts of how Hughes manipulated situations to be alone with children. Though not every memory could be nailed to a specific date, the pattern was undeniable. The wider Australian public began to wrestle with uncomfortable questions. If this was true, how had no one intervened earlier? Why had complaints been ignored? And what did it say about the television industry as a whole? These questions rattled not just the entertainment sector, but schools, churches, and any institution where children had once been taught to trust adults without question. There's a fringe tidbit worth noting. During this time, old VHS tapes of Hey Dad began disappearing from secondhand shops. Some people didn't want the association anymore, while others quietly collected them, knowing the episodes would eventually carry an eerie historical weight. Pop culture sometimes leaves artifacts that turn sinister, and in this case, a once-loved sitcom became a physical reminder of betrayal. As the investigation solidified, Hughes's defenses weakened. Police testimonies stacked up, public support dwindled, and the image of Australia's sitcom dad dissolved under the weight of evidence. By 2014, prosecutors were ready. The trial would not just determine Hughes' fate, it would force a nation to confront how easily charisma and fame can mask crimes, and how silence can stretch for decades before breaking. The story was moving inevitably toward a courtroom, where the laughter track would be replaced by sworn oaths, and where the truth, long delayed, would finally be laid bare. It is early 2014, and the hushed gravity of a Sydney courtroom feels a world away from the brightly lit set of Hey Dad. Once, Robert Hughes had walked through sound stages, greeted by applause and laughter. Now, he enters court flanked by security officers, his face grim, his hair graying. The courtroom, with its high ceilings and echoing footsteps, becomes the stage for a very different kind of performance. This time, there are no scripts, no laugh tracks, and no second takes. Only sworn testimony, cross-examinations, and the eyes of a nation watching closely. The trial drew immense public attention. Journalists filled the press benches, their pens scratching down details that would ripple through the next day's headlines. Outside, protesters gathered with signs condemning child abuse, their voices cutting through the courthouse air. Inside, survivors who had once been silenced finally had their chance to speak. Each testimony carried the weight of decades. Memories that had been suppressed, doubted, or dismissed, now sharpened into words under oath. The prosecution painted a picture of the systematic abuse, moments when Hughes exploited his role as a trusted adult, creating situations where young girls were isolated and vulnerable. They emphasized the consistency of accounts across different survivors, stories that spanned years but echoed with haunting similarity. The detail of how Hughes engineered private moments, sometimes on set, sometimes off, was presented as evidence of intent, not accident. Hughes's defense team countered aggressively. They argued that the accusations were unreliable, the result of fading memories and distorted recollections. They leaned on the passage of time, suggesting that decades-old claims could not possibly stand up to scrutiny. At one point, the defense even suggested that Monahan and others had been motivated by publicity. a claim that drew gasps from courtroom observers. Investigators still question whether Hughes truly believed in his innocence, or whether denial was simply the last mask he had left to wear. Among the quirks of the trial was the reemergence of "Hey Dad" footage. Clips were played in court, not for entertainment, but to establish timelines and working relationships. Imagine sitting there, hearing the canned laughter of the sitcom while knowing the accusations being leveled against its star. Jurors watched these tapes with stone faces, the contrast between the cheerful scenes and the testimonies outside of them only heightening the unease. The mainstream fact is this: on 7th April 2014, the jury delivered its verdict. Hughes was found guilty on 9 counts, including 2 sexual assault charges and 7 indecent assault charges. The offenses involved girls aged between 7 and 15 during the 1980s. The announcement rippled through the courtroom: gasps, tears, silence. For survivors, it was a moment of recognition, long denied. For Hughes, it was the collapse of an entire public identity. The fringe detail, however, is how some jurors later described the emotional weight of the case. Though anonymous, a few admitted to struggling with sleepless nights, haunted by the stories they had heard. One reportedly said that Hughes's sitcom persona had briefly clouded their judgment at the start of deliberations, a reminder of just how powerful on-screen images can be in shaping perception. But when they looked at the evidence as a whole, the illusion cracked irreparably. In the days following the verdict, newspapers carried photos of Hughes looking downcast, escorted by officers. His former co-stars reacted publicly, some expressing relief that justice had been served, others admitting they felt guilt for not having recognized the signs sooner. Social media, still relatively new as a cultural megaphone in 2014, erupted with outrage and support for the survivors. Hughes, once Australia's dad, was now branded a predator. The courtroom, in its solemn and methodical way, had dismantled his reputation piece by piece, and though the verdict brought relief, it also left lingering questions. How had this been allowed to continue for so long? Who had looked away when action could have been taken? In that courtroom reckoning, the sitcom glow finally burned out. There were no more lines to deliver, no more illusions to maintain, only the stark truth laid bare in the unforgiving light of justice. The courtroom had spoken, and you can almost hear the collective intake of breath across Australia. Robert Hughes, once a beloved fixture of weekly television, was now guilty on 9 counts, 2 sexual assault and 7 indecent assault charges. You picture the jury delivering the verdict, each word slicing through the carefully constructed image of the man who had been TV's dad. The weight of decades-long silence settled heavily in the room, a tangible force pressing down on everyone present. For the survivors, this moment wasn't just legal, it was deeply personal, a recognition that their courage had prevailed against a system that had once overlooked them. The media coverage was immediate and intense. Across television screens and newspaper pages, Hughes's face was juxtaposed with stills from "Hey Dad." The cheerful sitcom world he once ruled now tainted by the gravity of truth. Australia grappled with the stark dissonance. How could a man who elicited laughter and warmth from millions also perpetrate harm behind closed doors? Investigators still question whether Hughes's on-screen persona delayed accountability, creating a protective aura that made authorities and colleagues hesitant to believe the allegations for so many years. The legal significance of the case extended beyond Hughes himself. It became a reference point for how child abuse allegations in the entertainment industry could be handled, highlighting the importance of taking historical claims seriously. Prosecutors emphasized that despite the time gap, the consistency of survivors' testimonies, combined with corroborating evidence from colleagues and production schedules, created a compelling, credible picture of systemic abuse. This pattern of carefully documented misconduct showed a deliberate exploitation of trust and authority. The sentencing process began in May 2014, and the courtroom once again braced for the outcome. Hughes faced a maximum sentence of 10 years and 9 months, with a non-parole period of 6 years. For many Australians, this represented both punishment and symbolic justice, a societal acknowledgement of the wrongs inflicted and a deterrent against future abuse. The sentencing remarks underscored the severity of Hughes's breach of trust, particularly given his public role as a father figure. Fringe details from the proceedings add layers to the narrative. Some witnesses described Hughes's courtroom demeanor as calm, almost detached, which contrasted sharply with the gravity of the charges. Others noted moments of visible tension, small gestures betraying anxiety that had been hidden behind years of carefully curated charm. These subtle behaviors intrigued both legal analysts and psychologists observing the case, illustrating how a public persona can fracture under scrutiny. The mainstream historical fact remains clear. Hughes was sentenced to serve a significant prison term, cementing the legal acknowledgement of his crimes. For survivors, the judgment validated years of fear and silence, providing a sense of closure, albeit partial. The court's decision also set a precedent in Australia, demonstrating that celebrity status does not exempt anyone from accountability, regardless of the passage of time. In the wider cultural landscape, the sentencing catalyzed public discourse about child safety on sets, the responsibilities of producers, and the limits of trust when it comes to adult authority figures. The conversation wasn't only about Hughes. It was about a systemic culture that had allowed inappropriate behavior to persist unchecked. Fringe commentary noted that old episodes of Hey Dad were suddenly being revisited with new eyes, as viewers reassessed scenes and interactions in light of the convictions. Investigators still question whether the industry as a whole learned enough from Hughes's case, or if similar patterns of silence persist behind the scenes. Despite the formal closure in court, the societal ramifications continued to unfold, reminding everyone that accountability is not just about a single individual. It's about the structures that enabled the abuse. In the end, the guilty verdict marked a definitive turn in the story of Robert Hughes. Once celebrated as a television icon, he now stood as a convicted child abuser. The transformation from household hero to criminal was complete, but the impact of the case on survivors, on the entertainment industry, and on public consciousness remains resonant. The courtroom, after months of deliberation and testimony, had delivered its message. Fame does not absolve, and silence can no longer protect those who betray trust. After the courtroom drama concluded, Robert Hughes faced the reality of incarceration. You can imagine the stark contrast between the bright, bustling sets of Hey Dad, with their laughter and staged domestic warmth, and the cold, austere environment of an Australian prison. Gone were the cameras, the adoring fans, and the carefully constructed image of TV's dad. In their place were metal bars, strict routines, and the constant hum of institutional authority. It was a world where charm no longer mattered, where past fame could not shield one from consequences. Hughes was sentenced to 10 years and 9 months, with a non-parole period of 6 years. The correctional system became a new stage, one he could not control. Prison routines demanded compliance and accountability. Every day, the laughter of studio audiences was replaced by the stark reality of confinement, each hour measured and unyielding. For Hughes, the environment tested not only freedom, but ego. The persona he had cultivated for decades could no longer shield him from scrutiny or consequences. For the victims, Hughes's imprisonment was both relief and a complex emotional milestone. Seeing someone who had wielded such power now under institutional control validated years of trauma. It provided a sense of justice, though not a cure for the emotional scars that lingered. Investigators still question whether the prison system, while punitive, truly addresses the long-term psychological needs of survivors, a reminder that justice is legal, but healing is personal. Fringe details of prison life reveal moments that, while minor, highlight the human side of confinement. Hughes reportedly engaged in routine activities like reading, participating in vocational programs, and attending therapy sessions. Observers noted that despite his public fall, he tried to navigate prison life with a semblance of order, an attempt perhaps to reclaim control in a setting designed to strip it away. These small adjustments underline the contrast between celebrity life and life behind bars. The mainstream historical fact is clear. Hughes served time in New South Wales correctional facilities. Over the years, he applied for parole multiple times, with each application evaluated for risk to the community and the conditions necessary to mitigate potential harm. These assessments were meticulous, reflecting the seriousness of his crimes and the high-profile nature of his case. Public sentiment during Hughes's imprisonment was polarized. Some Australians felt satisfied that justice had been served, believing the sentence proportional to the harm inflicted. Others expressed lingering unease, questioning whether the punishment was sufficient given the profound emotional impact on the victims. Social discourse often revisited the themes of trust, power, and institutional responsibility, ensuring that Hughes's case remained a reference point for discussions about child safety and entertainment. A quirky detail emerged from media coverage. Some former cast members reflected publicly on the surreal nature of seeing Hughes' life reduced to daily prison routines. The contrast between his once glamorous celebrity status and his new environment offered an almost cinematic depiction of downfall, underscoring the profound consequences of his actions. While incarcerated, Hughes remained subject to monitoring and restrictions, including limitations on contact with minors. These legal safeguards were designed to prevent recidivism and protect the community, reflecting lessons learned from cases involving individuals who previously held positions of trust. Investigators still question whether such measures are sufficient, highlighting ongoing debates about rehabilitation and public safety. As the years passed, the narrative surrounding Hughes shifted. No longer simply a sitcom star, he became a symbol of both the dangers of unchecked authority and the resilience of those who survived abuse. The prison sentence, though finite, represented only a part of the broader story, one that includes legal precedent, public awareness, and the ongoing work of survivors reclaiming their voices. Hughes's time behind bars demonstrated the limits of fame and the enduring power of accountability. The walls of the prison, harsh and unyielding, reflected a society unwilling to overlook abuse, even decades after the fact. And as the years moved on, attention gradually turned to the next chapter: parole, potential release, and the continuing debate over what true justice and safety look like. After serving the majority of his sentence, Robert Hughes faced the prospect of parole, a legal process that would determine whether he could re-enter society under supervision. For many Australians, this was a tense moment, balancing the principles of rehabilitation with the undeniable gravity of his crimes. You can picture the hearings: lawyers presenting risk assessments, psychologists evaluating his potential for reintegration, and victims' advocates delivering statements about the enduring impact of his abuse. Every word, every report carried weight, as the board considered not only Hughes himself but the broader message about accountability and public safety. Hughes's parole applications were met with skepticism. Survivors and child protection organizations expressed deep concerns, emphasizing that releasing a man convicted of multiple child sex offenses, even after years in prison, posed risks. Investigators still question whether parole boards in such high-profile cases adequately account for the trauma of survivors or focus primarily on institutional metrics like compliance and behavior in custody. Public discourse was heated, with petitions, media campaigns, and social media commentary all converging on the question: should someone like Hughes be allowed back into society, even under supervision? The mainstream historical fact is that Hughes eventually received parole after serving a significant portion of his sentence. This release, though legally sanctioned, did not erase the stigma or the societal memory of his actions. Community reaction was mixed. Some considered it a procedural inevitability, while others viewed it as a moral compromise. A reminder that legal outcomes and emotional justice are not always aligned. A fringe detail from this period illustrates the surreal nature of fame and fall. Some former fans and local residents reported seeing Hughes quietly navigating public spaces, avoiding cameras, and attempting to maintain a low profile. His attempts at anonymity highlighted the bizarre contrast between a life once lived under bright studio lights and one now constrained by both public scrutiny and the legal limitations of post-incarceration life. Hughes's deportation from Australia after his release added another layer to the story. Born in England but naturalized in Australia, he eventually renounced his Australian citizenship, and authorities facilitated his return to the United Kingdom. This move, while legally straightforward, left many in Australia feeling ambivalent. On one hand, he was no longer physically present to pose a potential threat. On the other, the act of leaving quietly, without public acknowledgement of his crimes in his new country, raised questions about justice across borders. Investigators still question whether the deportation, while administratively effective, truly addressed community concerns or served the survivor's sense of closure. In some ways, it created a disconnection. Hughes was removed from the immediate environment, but the societal reckoning remained, unresolved and ongoing. Meanwhile, the entertainment industry continued to reflect on lessons from the case. Child protection protocols were strengthened, reporting mechanisms clarified, and the psychological welfare of young performers became a more serious priority. Hughes's story, while tragic in its human cost, catalyzed systemic change, demonstrating how accountability can ripple far beyond the courtroom. The quirky side of public reaction emerged in digital spaces. Online forums, commentary threads, and social media posts debated the ethics of his parole and deportation. Some mused about the irony of the man who had once delivered humor in suburban living rooms now quietly navigating airports, a figure both infamous and almost ghostly. These cultural artifacts, while minor, underscore how Hughes' narrative has been embedded in both legal history and popular consciousness. Through it all, the central truth remains. Hughes's crimes, convictions, and eventual deportation illustrate the intersection of fame, abuse, and the long arc of justice. For survivors, society, and historians alike, the story is a reminder that legal outcomes, while crucial, are only part of a larger tapestry of accountability, memory, and ongoing reflection. As the years passed following Robert Hughes' deportation, public debate shifted toward the broader implications of his case. People began asking not only how such abuses could happen, but why they persisted for so long without intervention. The industry faced tough questions. Were the safeguards sufficient? Did networks and producers do enough to protect child actors? Investigators still question whether systemic failures, ranging from inadequate oversight to the idolization of celebrity, allowed Hughes' crimes to go unchecked for decades. Hughes's story became a cautionary tale, cited in legal and academic discussions about child protection. The Australian media revisited archival footage, old interviews, and behind-the-scenes anecdotes to analyze the cultural and institutional conditions that enabled him. Fringe accounts from former crew members, once overlooked, now added texture to the narrative, highlighting moments of discomfort that, in hindsight, were part of a pattern. Together, these perspectives painted a portrait not just of one man, but of an industry that had failed in its duty of care. The parole debate also had psychological dimensions. Survivors spoke publicly about the fear and anxiety induced by the possibility of Hughes's release. Even when he was deported, the memory of his crimes lingered, a reminder that trauma is long-lasting. Psychologists explained how public figures who commit abuses can create a ripple effect, a mixture of fear, anger, and distrust that touches everyone exposed to the culture that once protected them. On a cultural level, Hughes's case shifted perceptions about child actors and their vulnerability. For decades, parents and guardians had assumed that a studio set was a safe environment. Now, there was heightened awareness of the need for vigilance and reporting mechanisms, and stricter policies were introduced in the entertainment industry. Programs were established to educate children about personal boundaries and how to raise concerns safely, turning lessons learned from tragedy into preventive measures. A quirky, almost surreal detail emerged as the story continued. Hey, Dad, once rerun on various networks, gradually disappeared from circulation. Some channels withdrew it quietly, wary of public backlash. Collectors and historians noted the episode's eerie aura, reflecting how cultural artifacts are reassessed in light of scandal. Even laughter tracks, once benign, took on a chilling undertone when viewed through the lens of survivors' experiences. Investigators still question whether the reforms spurred by Hughes' case are sufficient. Although reporting mechanisms improved and awareness increased, questions remain about how well such measures are enforced and whether they truly prevent abuse in isolated or high-pressure environments. Hughes's story, while legally concluded, continues to inform discussions about child safety, celebrity, and accountability. Mainstream history records that Hughes's deportation effectively removed him from Australian jurisdiction, but the moral and societal reckoning continued. Public attention shifted to systemic reform rather than just individual punishment, highlighting how one case can catalyze broader change. Survivors, advocates, and policymakers alike continue to draw lessons, ensuring that the conversation extends beyond a single name or a single courtroom. In the quiet corners of social memory, Hughes's narrative also serves as a reminder of the fragility of trust. The man who once symbolized warmth and safety on television became a stark illustration of how appearances can mislead, how silence can enable, and how speaking out can finally bring light to the darkest corners of public life. You can almost feel the echo of history in the aftermath of Robert Hughes' case. Even years after his conviction and deportation, the ripple effects continue through the entertainment industry, media ethics, and survivor advocacy. His story became a touchstone in Australia, a reminder that fame, charm, and public adoration can conceal serious misconduct. Institutions, once slow to act, now face pressure to implement preventative measures and foster environments where children can speak without fear. Investigators still question whether these changes go far enough, or if complacency and protection of celebrity figures remain systemic risks. For former cast members and crew, the emotional toll persists. They have spoken candidly about long-suppressed memories, the sense of guilt for not noticing, and the relief that the legal system finally acknowledged the survivors' experiences. Some describe ongoing therapy and support groups as vital tools for processing trauma, while others channel their experiences into advocacy work, lobbying for stronger child protection policies in the entertainment sector. Their personal journeys remind us that justice extends beyond courts. Recovery and acknowledgement are lifelong processes. From a mainstream historical perspective, Hughes's convictions, prison term, and eventual deportation constitute a rare and stark example of accountability for a high-profile figure in Australian television. These events reshaped public discourse, making it clear that child protection is not merely a private or familial concern, but a societal imperative. Hughes's actions and the delayed response of authorities prompted legislation and policies to safeguard young performers, reflecting a collective learning process born from tragedy. A fringe aspect of Hughes' legacy can be found in the way popular culture has memorialized the story. Discussions in online forums, podcasts, and retrospectives often highlight the contrast between the sitcom HUS cheerful on-screen presentation and the hidden abuses behind the scenes. Collectors, researchers, and journalists note the almost surreal juxtaposition. The laughter tracks once taken for granted now serve as eerie reminders of the divide between public perception and private reality. Public debate continues regarding how society should balance punishment, rehabilitation, and education. Hughes's case prompts uncomfortable questions about the responsibility of institutions, the influence of celebrity, and the need for vigilant oversight when children are involved. Survivors' voices are increasingly recognized as central to these discussions, underscoring the principle that prevention and support are as crucial as legal recourse. The broader cultural impact is notable. Australian television, once somewhat insulated, now faces scrutiny regarding the treatment of minors in production environments. Training programs, mandatory reporting procedures, and enhanced welfare checks are all direct results of lessons learned from Hughes's crimes. Even decades later, educators, producers, and policymakers cite the case as an example of why vigilance is necessary, ensuring that history informs the present. A quirky detail persists. Digital archives of Hey Dad, once celebrated, are now approached with caution. Scholars and media critics use them as teaching tools, examining how culture can normalize authority figures and obscure warning signs. Meanwhile, the survivors' narratives remain central, reminders that history is not just about fame, ratings, or nostalgia, but about real people, enduring consequences, and the courage it takes to speak out. Hughes's story is not neatly concluded with his prison sentence or deportation. It lives in policies, public consciousness, and survivor advocacy, emphasizing that while legal systems enforce accountability, societal vigilance sustains protection. His case serves as both warning and lesson, illustrating the fragile interplay of power, trust, and responsibility that surrounds children in any high-profile environment. The final chapter of Robert Hughes' story is a quiet reckoning, one that extends beyond headlines and courtrooms into the collective memory of Australia. You can envision the empty studio where Hey Dad was filmed, the laughter tracks long since faded, replaced by echoes of what survivors endured. Hughes, once a celebrated television father, now exists largely in legal records and cultural discourse, a symbol of both failure and accountability. His actions, convictions, and eventual deportation remain a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority and misplaced trust. Hughes's legacy is complicated. To some, he remains a figure of scandal. To others, a cautionary tale about the responsibility society holds toward its youngest and most vulnerable. Investigators still question whether institutions learned fully from the case, or whether similar vulnerabilities persist behind closed doors. The story forces reflection on systemic issues, how easily fame and public affection can shield misconduct, and how long it can take for truth to surface. Survivors, however, have reclaimed agency. Through advocacy, media appearances, and public speaking, they ensure the lessons from Hughes's crimes endure. These narratives reinforce that justice is not merely punitive. It's about visibility, recognition, and creating safer spaces for children in all environments. Fringe accounts from former cast and crew add depth, highlighting the quiet, often overlooked ways in which abuse was noticed but ignored, and how courage eventually overcame silence. Legally, Hughes's case stands as precedent in Australia, illustrating how long-term investigations and survivor testimonies can lead to convictions, even decades after the crimes occurred. His prison sentence, non-parole period, and deportation demonstrate the reach of accountability, but culturally, the conversation continues. Australia's entertainment industry reformed child protection practices, emphasizing monitoring, reporting, and the psychological welfare of young performers, a direct response to the lessons learned from Hughes's actions. A quirky, almost ironic detail is how Hey Dad, once widely adored, has become a subject of study rather than entertainment. Media scholars analyze episodes not for humor, but for glimpses of behind-the-scenes dynamics, power structures, and the subtle ways authority was exerted over child actors. The contrast between on-screen innocence and off-screen misconduct provides chilling insight into how appearances can deceive. Mainstream history remembers Hughes as both a television icon and a convicted abuser, a duality that underscores the complexity of fame. Public discourse now blends cautionary lessons with survivor advocacy, ensuring that his story functions as more than mere scandal. It is a case study in institutional responsibility, the limits of celebrity protection, and the resilience of those who speak out. Ultimately, Robert Hughes' saga is a reminder that justice is multifaceted. Legal outcomes are vital, but societal change, awareness, and survivor empowerment endure long after verdicts are delivered. The bright lights of the sitcom may have faded, but the lessons remain. And as you reflect on this story, you recognize the enduring impact of speaking out, the necessity of vigilance, and the importance of protecting the most vulnerable, no matter how charming the public persona may appear. Now, let yourself settle into a quiet space as the echoes of this story fade gently into memory. The narrative of Robert Hughes reminds you that appearances are rarely what they seem, and that the people we idolize can sometimes hide darkness behind familiar smiles. It's a story of courage, silence, and the painstaking journey toward accountability. A reminder that speaking out can shift not just individual lives, but entire industries. Consider the resilience of survivors who faced disbelief, fear, and decades of quiet suffering before finally reclaiming their voices. Their bravery demonstrates that the weight of secrecy is heavy, but not insurmountable, and that justice, though delayed, can arrive when truth is pursued relentlessly. The lessons from Hughes. Crimes extend beyond television. They touch every space where trust is given and authority is wielded, reminding us to remain vigilant and compassionate. It is also worth acknowledging the transformative power of reflection. As you let the story settle, think about how societies can learn, adapt, and implement safeguards to prevent future harm. The reforms inspired by this case, stricter child protection policies, improved reporting mechanisms, and survivor advocacy, are the living legacy that ensures lessons are not lost. Finally, allow yourself to release the tension carried through the tale. The courtroom drama, the tension of revelations, and the echoes of laughter once masking harm can all drift away. What remains is understanding, empathy, and the quiet reassurance that vigilance, courage, and truth can prevail. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the story's gravity ease into calm awareness, carrying with it insight and a deepened sense of care for those who cannot always speak for themselves.